but I'm curious, how are you? Like, what's going on in your life? I know you were just giving me a little bit about what you got going on today. How are you otherwise?
Up and down,
Okay.
up and down these days. I mean, um, I'm looking at a major publisher wanting to buy my book. The book's been out for 3 years, right?
Mm,
So now a major publisher wants to take it and publish it, kind of across a broad platform. And it's a little destabilizing for me
mm.
because I'm used to, in my own little world, playing. I mean, the book sold 60,000 copies as a self-published, so it's,
Congratulations.
yeah, it's kind of setting records as far as that kind of stuff goes. But it's interesting to see when you go to, what's the saying? It's like another level, another devil. Right. So
Mm.
there's always something. So you think, oh, when I get to this place, it'll be great. When I get on Joe Rogan, this will be great. When I do this, it's like, and then you actually achieve these things, and it is great. Like it is great, but it's not a feeling that I'm used to,
Mm.
and I think a lot of my life, I think a lot of my youth I spent just sort of overcoming challenges. My dad was schizophrenic. I was fairly slight when I was younger. So I started working out hard when I was, in my late teens, put about 25 pounds of muscle on me, and nobody challenged me at that point. So it's like, so I've learned these kind of, I don't want to say artificial, but these ways of kind of coping and accomplishing that may not be coming from this really authentic, grounded place in me, and more of a place of having to look good, or
Mm.
not being weak, like the typical male thing. It's like, I'm going to make myself look so strong that I just can deny my vulnerability. So I think I'm kind of in that phase right now, man. It's like there's points in the day where I'm at the gym and I'm playing my, my motivational songs and I'm feeling awesome. And there's other points it's like, this is so different than my life as a medical doctor. So
Mm.
yeah, it's a real change, another level, another devil. I think that's a great saying for me right now.
What are your go-to motivational songs in the gym? What's on the playlist?
There's one, oh, what's it, hell yeah, make this the best night of your life. This will be the best damn night of your life. I think hell yeah, or hell yay, or something like that. Revolution, I think, is the name of the band. I played it like so many times you think I know the song. That's a big thing. And there's also what I'll do in there is I'm on Spotify, so I will play like motivational speeches on
Mm.
there as well, and just to get myself kind of jazzed up and that kind of thing. And it's amazing how much dopamine you can create just from music,
Yeah.
just from motivational speeches, which I find kind of artificial. It's like, you can do it, don't get in your way, nothing can stop you, that kind of stuff. It's a bit schmaltzy when you really
Mm.
listen to it, but it has that effect of motivating you or directing you on a course.
Yeah. I have a few songs that I can put on, and it's interesting when it comes to music for me personally. It really depends on the mood, but there are just a few songs that I know will pull on the heartstrings
Mm,
sometimes, others that will definitely get me amped up and going. So music is definitely an interesting thing, but I actually want to move backwards very quickly because before I
sure.
forget this, you were talking about the ups and downs, the roller coaster of life, right?
Yeah.
I'm really curious to know if you ever feel like you want to break from that. And I know you're a doctor, so that could potentially be interpreted as maybe, knock on wood that it's not the case, but like suicidal ideation where, like you ever feel like you just want off the roller coaster for just a little bit, like you just want the coaster to coast. Does that ever happen to you?
Yeah, I used to a lot. I mean, lately, what I've been telling my friends is I don't have to work as hard as I used to, in a
Mm.
way, in a way. So the analogy that I draw is, the space shuttle when it goes up and after it hits kind of like the stratosphere, the two rocket boosters kind of fall away, right?
Mm.
So it needed those rocket boosters to break the gravity, or break the hold that the Earth has on us. But after that, there's a certain amount of credibility that you've gained, or a certain amount of momentum that you've gained, that allows you to just keep going. And sometimes I don't think we really realize that we've actually broken through.
Mm.
And if you come from an attitude of you've got to work hard, you've got to accomplish, when you actually do accomplish, you don't give yourself the credit. And I think there is this feeling like you still haven't made it yet. Like there's
Mm.
such a thing as making it, right? Like, I could have millions of dollars and beyond, all the famous things, and still, I would think have this thing like, oh, I've got to accomplish more. Now that's tempered by the fact that I know that's not the case. Like there's a part of me internally that just knows it's very grateful and grounded and happy to be where I'm at. Today happens to be one of those days where I just feel kind of tired and a little burned out. And I've had a bunch of different things from a bunch of different angles. Like I do these one-on-one coaching sessions with people, and I find them very draining because I go into the person and I kind of read, I'm kind of like I'm not a therapist, but I'm kind of a triagist. It's like what I can do is I can show you where your triggers are. I can show you where your pain lies, in your body and where it comes from, like as a child. And then you can go off to like an IFS worker or an SEE therapist or whatever, and then you can polish it up from there. But that's my gift, is being able to look into you, see where your pain is, exactly where it is, and then give you the template that you can go and find a therapist that can work with you once a week. Because I don't work with people on a regular basis. I kind of go in there, I show them where their pain is, I show them how to deal with it, which is usually connecting your mind and your body and connecting your adult self with your child self. And once you do that, once you have the template, then you just have to practice.
Yeah. Is that what that artwork is behind you, Inner Child?
Kind of, yeah. Like it's from Burning Man. So it's like
Okay.
I can show you a little bit more about it. I don't know if you can see there. There's the book. So it's
Oh,
basically
cool.
there. So it's two adults that are kind of arguing with each other, and the inner child in both of them wants to connect. So that's really, I think that's kind of what life is about too, is like this, we want so badly to be connected. But depending on what connection meant to you as a child, like for me, my dad was schizophrenic. So he was, kind and funny and thoughtful and generous, but then he would go manic or depressed or psychotic, and I would lose that. So it's kind of like I learned that trusting love isn't safe because it can all get pulled away from you. So that's why I've been married 3 times. It's one of those things where I think we get into this place where we don't trust love. If you have trauma as a child, I think you lose faith in the world. And when you lose faith in the world, the natural corollary of that is you start thinking that everything is up to you. Right? So everything is up to you. And you're also a child. So on one hand, you're 8 years old, you start believing unconsciously, like this isn't something you say as an 8-year-old, everything's up to me. But I think when you lose faith in the safety of the world, you start looking for your own internal sense of safety. And this is where we develop these reactive coping mechanisms, overthinking, rumination, excessive exercise. All this kind of stuff comes in as a coping strategy, as a defensive accommodation to the trauma. So we are born kind of with this authentic self, and then depending on how much trauma we get, we develop into a reactive self, like a people pleaser or being aggressive. So, and we learn those strategies and they work to some extent. But the problem is overthinking and rumination may have helped you as a child to kind of get past what your current trauma was at the time. But we keep riding that till the wheels come off. So we're 45 years old and we're still in our heads. We don't realize that we're adults anymore. We're not in that same powerless, helpless situation that we were in as a child. We are actually adults. If you look at the way the amygdala works, the amygdala in the brain has no sense of time. So when we get triggered, we turn into an 8-year-old, although we don't think we're an 8-year-old, because we look at ourselves in the mirror and we go, well, clearly I'm not 8 years old, but you are. And how much, confidence are you going to have in the world dealing with the trauma as an 8-year-old? And then we get in that's what the poster is. So we get two of us, we get two people that both regress back into their own, childhood wounds in a couple, and both of you turn 8 years old, and both of you are trying to get your 8-year-old needs met in a trauma format with the other person who's also traumatized, who's also regressed back to a place of emotional reactivity. So then we get into these things where, we fight, or we withdraw, or, it shows up in your couple dynamics. Like it shows up in your relationship with your parents, relationship with your kids, but mostly in the relationship with your partner. That's how it shows up. And then we have two 8-year-olds kind of fighting with each other, and it's not going to go well.
Absolutely, yeah. I will be very transparent. I reacted like an 8-year-old today when I was triggered. So
Okay.
I'm still a work in progress. I hung up the phone on someone I shouldn't have hung up the phone on, but it's a work in progress, as mentioned. But it leads me to ask you this. We're talking about how we come into this world as that pure, authentic self. And then, of course, as we go through life, we may experience big T's or little T's or
Right.
whatever the case may be. Is it possible through all the work that we can do, internal family systems, cognitive behavioral therapy, psychedelics, etc., is it possible to get back to that purity, that authentic self at its core?
I think that's a
Like,
great, yeah, like almost like the tabula rasa, the blank slate again. I don't think so. Like
okay.
I think those programs, when they're in there, they're always in there.
Mm,
The amygdala never forgets. But we can start overwriting those programs. And I think
mm,
that's where context comes into play. And if you look at the way the hippocampus and the amygdala react together, the hippocampus is kind of like it's kind of like a caterpillar, and the caterpillar's head is the amygdala. So the hippocampus has this ability to provide context in a situation. So if you're in a haunted house for Halloween and someone jumps out or something jumps out at you, you'll get scared, but it's like, well, this is just something that's fake. But if you're on an airplane and the airplane all of a sudden starts a 200-foot dive, you're in it, and
mm,
there's no amount of like the hippocampus trying to reassure you is going to make a lot of difference in the acute stages of that. So I think what we learn when we learn like different therapeutic processes and when we learn how to ground ourselves in our body is the hippocampus starts to learn context. Like we can still be safe in the face of something that reminds us of our childhood wound.
mm,
So if I see someone, say, dealing with a parent who's either addicted or has mental illness, it will trigger me for sure because and it will always likely trigger me. But now I realize the context, and actually helping other people with this issue as well has helped me kind of get into this place that I can set a new context to that old wound. So the old wound will always be there. It's just, I think what psychedelics do and what talk therapy to some extent does, but mostly somatic therapy does, is that it allows you a different context. Like my body still feels safe, even though I'm experiencing the same trauma as I did as a child. My body feels safe, so I must be okay. And I think that's what we lose in a lot of traditional therapies is we try and explain to ourselves, hey, you're still okay. Like you're in this room with your therapist. You're okay. But that cognitive explanation doesn't really reach that subcortical, that below the level of the thinking mind place where a lot of these traumas are stored.
mm. So you were talking about earlier, being able to identify where someone's pain is.
Yeah.
Now, what's your advice for someone to start to identify that for themselves? Like, how do we know? And I guess for clarity purposes, are you referring to where it's actually stored in the body
Yeah.
physically
That's the
or?
first place. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. That's the first place. So if someone comes to me and they say, my mother was really demanding,
Mm,
she was always on me about gaining weight, or my grades weren't good enough, or there was some physical part of me that she kept picking on. Now what I'll do with people is it's like, okay, now instead of going into the story of that, when you think of your mother criticizing your weight or your face or whatever, where do you sense that? Like where
mm,
does that come up in your body? And a lot of people, specifically women with narcissistic mothers or demanding mothers, often they'll feel it in their throat. It's like, oh, I feel this pressure in my throat. It's like, okay, well, where is it? Is it upper or lower? It's like, oh, it's down there. Is it superficial? Is it deep? It's kind of like, it's in the middle. Is it hot or is it cold? It may not have a temperature. It's like, it feels kind of hot and kind of icy cold at the same time, which is curious how people describe it because it can be contradictory like that because the unconscious is very contradictory.
mm,
We don't often have a really good way of explaining feeling. We do our best with language, but the language is the best thing that we have to explain feeling. And it kind of falls short in a lot of ways. It's
mm,
too bad we can't feel someone else's brain or feel someone else's feeling because then we would have a real sense of what's going on with them. But what I will do usually is I'll get them to localize it. They'll say, okay, it's in my throat, it's hot, it's red, it's kind of swollen, it feels like a tingling or whatever. And we'll really drill down into the sensation of it because I do feel the more you drill down into the sensation of it, sometimes sensations, images, memories, behaviors will start coming out based on your focus on that sensation, rather than going up into your brain and going, okay, what does this mean? Like, oh, well, my mother was demanding, I had an eating disorder when I was 15. It's like, yeah, those are all like language. Those are all words. What's the feeling? Because in our society, we don't really deal with feeling very much. We think that changing the mind and changing the way you think is going to change the way you feel. Now, it does temporarily, but it doesn't permanently. And that's why cognitive therapies tend to wear off over time. Unless there's a somatic component to therapy, it doesn't tend to last. And people wind up a year later, after $5,000 worth of cognitive therapy, a year later, they're right back to the same anxious place they were before, because there was nothing in the body there to ground it.
Yeah. So I'm curious, if someone comes to you and, you're trying to identify where their pain is and you ask them where they feel it when they're talking about their trauma or what they've experienced, and they say, "Hey, Dr. Russ, like, I don't feel anything."
Yeah,
Like, is it possible that it's suppressed so far down that there's just no feeling at all?
totally. Yeah. And I see that quite frequently too. So usually at that point, we might do a few physiological sighs, 2 quick sniffs in, and then a long, slow exhale. That's up. I
Mm,
find that people almost always can feel it. They're just so guarded that they don't want to. And I don't blame them. And I say, specifically, this may be too much for you. So if it is too intense, let's back off. Let's go into some other place. So
mm,
it's really this sort of titration, sort of being able to kind of guide someone through, because they don't want to actually feel that pain. Because in some people, if you've had severe emotional, physical, sexual abuse, you don't want to go into that pain. And it's like, can I just get you to dip your toe into the idea that it might be in your body?
mm,
And sometimes it'll come up and they'll like, oh, okay, maybe I feel this, tingling in my trachea. That's what I had. This person the other day said, this tingling in my trachea. It's like, can we stay with that, or is that too much? It's like, it's kind of heavy, but we can stay with it. And then over the next 5 minutes or so, it became a pressure and it became cold. So it's just like, if you go in there, if you allow them to sort of dip their toe in the trauma and dip their toe in the sensation of it, often if they can stay with it, and some people can't, but if they can stay with it, it will start expanding. They will start getting more descriptors of that. And then often different sensations, memories, images, and that sort of stuff will be associated with that sensation. And then I really feel like we're getting at the root cause of where their anxiety, depression, eating disorder, personality disorder sits, because that's the manifestation of it in the body. And if you
mm,
look at neuroscience, if you look at the insular cortex in the brain, the part of the brain called the insula that sits deep, deep in the brain, it's kind of like the part of the brain that mediates the mind to the body and the body to the mind. So it's kind of like this way station. And my personal theory is that when we're traumatized as children, that insula, specifically the anterior part of the insula that's associated with the sensation in the body, forms a emotional signature of that pain. And our body feels exactly the same way now as it did when we were 5, 8, 10, 12 years old and we're walking home hoping that our mother's not going to be hammered drunk when we get home. It's
mm,
the same feeling in the body. And if it's the same feeling in the body, the mind, which is a compulsive meaning making, make sense machine, will make sense of that alarm by creating these alarming stories. And then we believe the alarming stories, which of course creates more alarm in the body, which creates more alarming stories. And on top of that, I'm giving you a tremendous amount of information in a short period of time here. Hopefully this isn't too much. But what happens is when we go into survival mode in our body is we shut off our prefrontal cortex, which is the kind of the rational executive functioning part of our brain. So not only do we make more worries because we're in threat physiology, we're in survival physiology, but we lose the part of the brain that would actually critically appraise those worries as unlikely to happen.
mm.
So A, we make more worries, and B, we believe them. So it becomes this snowball. And that's
Yeah,
that's that's when it really starts to crush people.
yeah. You were giving us an example of, someone that may have experienced a narcissistic parent per se. And I'm just curious, if we were to do like a body scan together, are there commonalities for where emotions live in the body? Like, does
Great question.
anger, yeah, does anger like live
Yeah.
in the hips or the back? Or I'm just curious, like, are there commonalities in that regard?
There are some body workers that kind of believe that. I think it becomes a confirmation bias, though.
Mm,
Whereas, if you feel like, oh, anger is held in the back, and then you talk to people and you find that anger is held in the back, then you create this thing that anger must be held in the back. And I think that's kind of, it's a bit too subjective. But I do find that a lot of this stress, pain, trauma gets held in the midline of the body. Like I rarely see people say, "Oh, it's in my right bicep,"
mm,
or it's in my left knee. It's almost always between the chin and the pubic bone, like in the center of the body. And if you look at the brain structure, anterior cingulate, posterior cingulate, just parts of the brain that are devoted to physical sensation, that's often where they will reflect in the body. So midline brain structures will often reflect to midline body structures. And I think that's why we feel, pain in the heart when we get broken up on, when we
mm,
have or experience a breakup or our pet dies or whatever, we feel an actual pain in our heart. And I think if we look at the way the structures are formed, like if you look at the posterior cingulate in particular, which is part of the default mode network in the brain, they think that maybe the posterior cingulate may be associated with a lot of self-referential thought. So shame, blame, judgment of yourself may be held kind of around this posterior cingulate area, which reflects to the central part of our body. So when we feel ashamed, we'll often feel it in the center part of our body.
mm.
When we feel like we're being blamed for something, it's often refers to the central part of our body. So that's a commonality that I will often see, is that I don't see often, I feel it in my right thigh or I feel it in my left elbow. It's usually along the center of the body somewhere. And almost always it's kind of more chest, and throat. Chest and throat are probably the biggest places that I see alarm in people. Gut too, but chest and throat are probably the number one and two.
Yeah. Dr. Russ, one thing that is confusing to me is like, if you cut my body open right now, you cut my arm open,
Mm-hmm.
you'll be able to see the muscle. You'll be able to see the bone, the whatever else is a part of the anatomy. I'm not by any means a
Right,
doctor. I went to school for business. You
right.
know, you'll be able to see those aspects, but emotion you can't see. So what confuses me is like, what is actually stored? To me, like, I want to answer my own question and say the energy of that emotion. But again,
Mm-hmm.
energy isn't something that you can remove and like hold in your hand.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's multiple places in the brain. If you look at the way the brain processes physical pain, a lot of those same areas are the places that process emotional pain.
Mm,
So it's it's a multifaceted thing. You look at the amygdala, hippocampus, pons, medulla, like different parts of the brainstem. There's all these parts that translate emotion on some level, and then you get what's a person's experience. Like if you are a child and you're constantly screamed at by your father, that is going to create a different pattern in you than someone that said had a loving, caring environment with their parents.
yeah.
So it's really fascinating to see, because they've searched for years like the source of fear, and like they'll say, oh, it's the amygdala. It's like, well, no, the amygdala actually has sources of pleasure in it as well. So it's not, you can't just sort of say this area of the brain is associated with this emotion, like you could with Broca's area, like area 44 for speech. If people have a stroke in Broca's area, they have difficulty expressing speech. So we can see that and we can go, okay, this is what happened. But we don't have that same kind of topographical, that ability to sort of say, this is where fear is, this is where anger is. It just doesn't occur.
Yeah. It's so interesting to me having this conversation. I'm sitting here in awe and I'm just like, is this a to me it's complex, but is it as complex as like a normal listener like myself to this, or is it simpler?
Well, I think it's just, find the emotion in your body.
Mm,
When you're triggered, if say you were raised by a parent or parents who weren't around,
mm,
you were a latchkey kid. So you finished school, you came home, and your parents didn't get home till 6 o'clock. That loneliness that you felt waiting for your parents to come home, like, where do you feel that in your body?
mm,
These are the things that I talk to people about, is like, we're such a neck up society. And I say to people, like, they say, well, what's the best treatment for anxiety? It's like, well, get into your body, get out of your head. Because, anxiety by definition is this, excess thinking, rumination. But your brain tells you that, oh, if you're scared, you can think your way out of it. But you can't. You just make it worse by thinking
Mm.
your way. So it's learning to, when you're feeling anxious, it's like, okay, can I just get out of my head for a second and say, what's the sensation going on in my body right now when I feel anxiety in my mind? Is it a pressure? Is it a pain? For me, it's in my solar plexus. It's purple. It's sharp. It presses up into my heart, into my back. Um, so it's really getting to know that source of pain. And here's the kicker on top of all of this stuff that we've talked about already, is that I believe that representation of anxiety in my system, in my solar plexus, that fish-shaped purple sensation, is my younger self.
Mm.
That is the younger version of me. So our alarm is the younger version of ourselves, modulated again by the insula. So if we can put our hand over it, if we can breathe into it, if we can kind of show that pain that we will see it, hear it, love it, and protect it, then we can kind of heal from it. But unfortunately, the way we're wired as human beings is that we avoid pain.
Mm.
So if we have that pain, and it took me like a trip on LSD to actually see this for myself. So it wasn't like I was able to kind of find this out empirically or through medicine or something like that. But it's finding this pain and realizing that, hey, that is your younger self. That is the child in you asking to be seen, heard, loved, and protected now in a way that they didn't get back then.
Yeah.
But the natural response is that we separate from it.
Mm.
Because I believe what anxiety is at its core, is a mind-body separation, and a separation of our adult self from our child self. So the adult in us doesn't want to go back to the child, because that's where the child experienced all this sort of abandonment, the bullying, the pain. And the child looks at the adult in us like, help me, help me, help me. And the adult's like, no, I can't. So the child doesn't trust the adult doesn't trust the child.
Mm.
And as we get older, our old traumas just continue us to put a crowbar between that ability to connect with each other. And that's what I believe creates alarm. And it's the alarm in our body that actually creates the anxiety of the mind.
Yeah. On the topic of anxiety, I'm really curious what your advice would be from a mindset perspective to someone that may view themselves differently for their mental health struggles. Maybe they're diagnosed with a disordered anxiety or
Sure.
experiencing depression. How do we not view ourselves differently or like less than for experiencing that?
Yeah, another great question. Because there is a lot of shame, blame, what I call jabs. There is like judgment, abandonment, blame, and shame of ourselves.
Mm.
Because I think when we're younger and we experience a trauma that's too much for us to bear, and our parents don't help us metabolize it, it does get stored in our body. It does get pushed down, and the body keeps the score. The body maintains that place. And your anxiety is basically your nervous system acting normally to a trauma that it couldn't process because it didn't have those adult figures to help you metabolize the pain at the time.
Mm.
So, energy can't be, created nor destroyed, and that energy's got to go somewhere. So it winds up getting stored in your body. In my book, Anxiety RX, I call it background alarm. And that background alarm kind of runs your mind. And in this process called interoception, the mind is always reading the body. And if you've got an old wound in there that just keeps, getting triggered, it's going to affect your mind. And it's going to
Mm.
cause your mind to become hypervigilant and worried. Because when you're a child, that's the only place you can go is your mind. You don't have power to do it any other way. So that self, you're continuing to judge, abandon, blame, and shame yourself if you continue on that program of saying I'm somehow defective or whatever. Because I felt like that too when I had anxiety, and you go to all these doctors, and you spend thousands of dollars on therapy and all this kind of stuff, and you think I am just broken, like
Mm.
I can't be healed. And it's because traditional therapy misses the mark. They think you can fix a thinking problem with more thinking, and
Mm.
you can't. It doesn't work that way. You need to ground yourself in your body. My wife is a somatic trauma therapist. She says this. She says, you need to ground people in their body first. And then all the cognitive stuff that they understand about their trauma and how they deal with it has a place to ground itself. Because if you just try and fix the mind with the mind is too, it's like air in Ayurvedic medicine. They call it vata. It's air. There's nothing there that actually sticks and holds and allows you to feel safe in that. Whereas if you start grounding in your body and you start creating a safe place in your body, then a lot of this therapy has a place to ground so that the next time you run into this same situation, and you will over and over again, you go, oh, you know what? Last time I did this, I was actually safe in my body. Even though my mind was going nuts, I
Mm.
was actually safe in my body, and I can do that again. And then it's just practice.
Yeah. Why does anxiety seem to come out of nowhere in people's lives? Like, I'll give you an example. Like,
Yeah, sure.
I mean, I can only speak for myself. Like, I don't think I ever experienced quote unquote anxiety until maybe college.
Okay.
Before then, I come from, a background with divorced parents. I acted out to get my mother's attention because she neglected me. Like I can go down the list of things that I feel like were either big or little T traumas in my life, but I never felt anxious until, let's call it, college. And I'm like, wait, like what changed? Like, where did this come from?
A lot of people can maintain their anxiety until they go away to college. Like I
Mm,
get that. I get that a lot because you're outside of your familiar environment. Um, your parents, whether or not they were supportive or not. But when we get outside of that environment, and this is what I see it with a lot of our children now, because we don't expose our children to a whole lot of negative emotion, or they get exposed to it and immediately they go to their phones. So they
mm,
never really learn how to deal with boredom, how to deal with envy, how to deal with disappointment, because as soon as they feel negative emotion, they go to their phone. But that stops working when they go off to college. So we're seeing it younger and younger and younger now with kids. But this is, I think, part of the anxiety is that our support systems are gone. So often people will say, and I hear this all the time, I wasn't anxious until my car accident at 24. I didn't
mm,
feel it. Now, you may have been anxious before that, but it sort of flew under the radar. And COVID did this to a lot of people because COVID pushed people out of their ability to feel secure within themselves.
mm,
And that really pushed people because my one of my favorite sayings from my one of my favorite people is Dr. Gordon Neufeld, who is my sort of mentor in developmental psychology. And he said, all anxiety is separation anxiety. And
mm,
it's really true. And I add on to that, and it's mostly separation from yourself. So when you feel separate from yourself and you can't connect with yourself through your body, through whatever, you're going to start feeling anxious. So I would suggest that perhaps your divorce parents affected you much more than you were aware of. And then all of a sudden something happened that sort of pushed you over the edge. You were able to tread water up until that point, and then something happens. And I see that with people all the time. They will say to me, I was fine until I had a car accident. I was fine until I got divorced. I was fine until my dog died. And it's not that. It's like you were treading water. You had it under there, but you were able to cope.
mm.
But then once that little thing tipped you over the edge, then the waterfall started.
Yeah. So, in regards to that definition of anxiety or the quote on anxiety, I'm curious, what would be your top three things to start getting connected to self or to at least start putting ourselves back in alignment, whether that be with our inner child and our adult self or whatever it would take?
Yeah. The first thing is when you feel anxious, or I like to say alarmed, when you feel alarmed, go into your body, get out of your head.
Mm,
It's easier said than done, but it's a practice that will save your life without a doubt. So the first thing is move out of your head and into your body, even if your body hurts, because it will. The
mm,
alarm that's stored in there is not a pleasant feeling, but it's being able to metabolize it and stay with it. And I think that's a lot of it is that we don't stay with the pain that's in our body. We'd much rather go up into our heads, which is what we did as children, which helped, but we're not children anymore. We actually have a lot more agency in our lives than that. The next thing I tell people is to tell yourself, I'm safe in this moment, or ask yourself, am I safe in this moment? I know I'm freaked out about my driver's test coming up. I know I'm freaked out about my dentist or my tax bill, or, going to see my mother who's sick or whatever. But in this moment, in the middle of the day, in the middle of the night, just ask yourself, am I safe in this moment?
Mm.
Because so often those of us with anxiety are used to living in this milieu of constant fear, although we're not aware of it. But we create this state of constant hypervigilance. And when we actually draw our attention to the moment that we're in and that we are safe, it can be a revelation for some people, because anxious people are so used to just keeping this sort of low grade level of anxiety going all the time, because it's familiar to us. It was familiar to our childhood. So what's familiar to us in childhood will automatically gravitate to and reproduce in our adulthood. Freud called it the repetition compulsion. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is just realizing that there's some faith, have some faith in the world,
Mm.
because so often anxious people become victims, and victims by definition don't have any faith because you're a victim. So that victim mentality just, it creates all this neurochemistry and physical chemistry, in that it creates norepinephrine in your brain, which activates your brain. It creates cortisol in your system through the hypothalamic pituitary axis, and it just creates these stress hormones in our system. Victim mentality creates stress hormones in our system. And then those things create all sorts of things like interleukin 1, interleukin 6, tumor necrosis factor, C-reactive protein. These are the things that create inflammation in the body. So this is why people get autoimmune disease that have childhood trauma,
Mm.
because it creates these things. So it's the ability to kind of have faith in the world. And, you've made it so far. You've probably been through some pretty horrible times, but you're here. So it's focusing on the fact that there is something greater than you. And I don't necessarily mean God or whatever you want to call it, but I think there is a consciousness, there is an order to the universe that keeps most of us safe most of the time. Now, if you watch the news, of course, you're going to have this idea that the world is this horribly unsafe place. And for some people, it is right now, especially. But in general, it's a pretty safe place. But because you've developed this, anxious people develop this pattern that they have to stay vigilant and they have to stay afraid in order to stay safe, which is a horrible program to run. I ran it for years. Just understanding that you can have faith. You
Mm.
can just have faith in something else, something other than you. Because when we start believing that everything's up to us, and this happens when we're 5, 8, 12 years old, we regress to a 5, 8, 12-year old when we have that feeling of anxiety. And, being an 8-year-old dealing with a relationship breakup or the death of your uh, dog or whatever is going to be devastating. But we have to realize that we're not children anymore. We actually have a lot more agency in the world, and we can choose to have faith as opposed to just go with this reactive victim mentality. So those are rather long kind of explanations of the three things that I would tell everybody as far as anxiety goes.
Yeah, that makes sense. A lot of it, and I appreciate that breakdown. I maybe should have asked this question first, but let's ask it now. What do you think are the top three leading factors to the increase in anxiety in our society and culture now? Like, what is
Sure.
causing that? I could assume that, you'll probably throw in the fact that a lot of us run away from our emotions and our pain and our traumas, but I'm curious
Yeah.
to know what you think.
Well, I think the bottom line is that we're treating each other as transactions rather than real people
Mm.
now. So, and this is very big in the States. It's you're not good for your your personhood.
Mm.
You're good because you can provide me with a sense of income. I can sell you something. Now this is very kind of, but it's unconscious. I think there is this sense that the currency of humanness is dropping.
Mm.
So we don't have that same sense of connectedness. The rules. I had this joke that I used to tell on stage as a stand-up comic, when I would say, I'm going to stop stopping at red lights, because I think red lights are just a sign of the patriarchy, and they slow me down. Like I need to get across town, and who are these red lights to stop me from getting where I'm going?
Mm.
Now we need order. Like we need order. Like the individual is important, absolutely, but we need order. And we're losing that order to everyone's own desire to be themselves, to exert their own authority on the society. And if everybody has their own traffic rules, just like they have their own rules about, sexuality, who can get married, all this kind of stuff, the society is going to disintegrate.
Mm-hmm.
And it is disintegrating on some level. And when we feel separate from each other, anxiety just starts to fill up our psyches. And then when we get anxious, we start doubling down on our own beliefs. So the confirmation bias comes up. So the tribalism comes up. It's like, well, those people must be causing my problems. Like the Republicans and the Democrats in the States, like it's just, I'm Canadian, so I look at this as a big circus. And maybe you guys do too. But it is one of those things where the separation is so great now. And the fact that people can just blatantly lie and just stick and double down and triple down on the lie when everyone knows, most people know anyway, that it's a complete lie. Again, it drops our human currency. It drops the dignity that we have as human beings, even if that dignity is an illusion, right? But that illusion kept us together. And we do need rules, and we do need to have this sense that we're all important, and we need to live with each other. But within that, we have to have rules. We have to have certain, like the traffic lights, we have to have certain rules. Otherwise, society descends into chaos. And the farther it descends into chaos, the more the human currency drops, and the more we dehumanize other people, the more we start wars and conflicts and violence. And it just, the society unravels, which of course, by its definition, is going to create a lot of anxiety. Now, that was probably a heavier definition than you expected, but that's kind of what I've been thinking about lately.
Well, it makes sense, and it also goes back to your mentor's quote on what anxiety is, right? I feel like that's in alignment, very much so.
Totally.
Yeah, yeah. I'm curious, what's a question you wish more people would ask you?
I think people are starting to now. So it's one of those things that I used to sort of lament, but I really understand now. It's like, why do you think that anxiety is held in the body?
Mm.
Because there is this story that I kind of love, and I don't know if it's true. It's kind of a parable that said that when the European ships came to North America, and the Native Americans saw these ships, they couldn't recognize the ships. They would say stuff like, the water looked funny, like the water looked like it was caved out. They actually couldn't, because they'd never seen ships this size before. So it's kind of like the same thing, is that when I adopt this theory as a medical doctor and a neuroscientist, that anxiety has much more to do with what old energy stored in the body than the thoughts of the mind. That goes 180 degrees against what conventional psychology and psychiatry think, which is change your thoughts, change your anxiety.
Mm.
I don't happen to believe that. So people are starting to ask me more. It's like, why do you think that anxiety is stored in the body? And that's why I talk about the anterior insula. I try to give people a very neuroscientific response, rather than going, oh, I feel that we need to understand our bodies and our minds, and everything's connected, and we're mind, body, and spirit, which is all true. And I can go into that sort of stuff. I have a real woo-woo flaky side, but I also have a very strong grounding in science. And I find that if you can explain sort of ethereal things in scientific terms, people start giving it more credibility, and they can actually start seeing the ships that I'm talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I've been doing, I only have you for a few more minutes here, and one thing that I've been doing on the way out of these interviews is asking a question to a past guest to ask our current guest, which is you.
Okay.
So this question comes from an individual that had no clue who the next guest was going to be.
Sure.
And she had asked you, how are the people, or who are the people you would choose to have around you if you had to do it all over again?
I don't know if I would change a lot.
Okay.
Because I think, having my schizophrenic father, having my, I don't want to say distant mother. I mean, she's Scottish, and they, the Scottish Reserve, there isn't a whole lot of I love yous. There's not a whole lot of hugs, but there is this sense that, she cared for me, that kind of thing. So, I mean, in a perfect world, I would have wanted parents who were more connected and loving, and could see my sensitive nature, and could see me for me, as opposed to see me as a vehicle to help them. And I think so often that happens is that people have kids to fulfill their own desires. And there's a wonderful saying that says that the greatest challenge a child can bear is the unlived life of a parent.
Mm.
So I don't know if I would change anything, because now if you would have asked me that 10 years ago, I would have said I would have liked to not have my dad. Like, but now I'm kind of realizing that, it's all part of it. I think that everything is consciousness. And I
Mm.
think we're all made of a little fabric of this consciousness. And we're all made a little different. Some of us have kidney disease. Some of us have an abusive parent. Some of us get in major car accidents. Some of us are quadriplegics. Consciousness has a way of trying to experience itself. And I think
Mm.
it experiences itself through us, because it can't experience itself as it is, because it is everything. I don't know if that makes sense. So it makes us all a little bit different. And it gives us all these different challenges. Some people have more overt challenges than others. And I think that I don't think I would change anything now, because it's actually allowed me to help myself and help so many other people. So I can really embrace what I didn't have back then and give it to myself now. Easier said
Mm.
than done. I still have days where I judge, abandon, blame, and shame myself. But in general, I have this sense of myself now that I'm okay. I'm good, and good things are coming to me, and they do. And again, that all comes back to just adopting a sense of faith in the world. So I don't think I would change anything.
Okay, so let me ask you this question. You make it sound like Dr. Russ of 10 years ago is a different person. And
Oh,
I'm sure,
he
yeah,
was.
I'm sure
Yeah,
you've grown, you've obviously evolved. We all, we're all growing whether we like it or not.
sure.
You're sitting across from Dr. Russ of 10 years ago. What's the piece of advice you're giving him?
Trust yourself.
Okay.
Trust yourself. Stop looking outside of you for the love, attention, support that you need to start taking from yourself.
Mm.
You're not a victim. You're not a victim. And I think 10 years ago, I did feel like a victim for sure. So it's like being able to, as cliche, love yourself, of course, but it's beyond that. It's see yourself as a part of consciousness.
Mm.
You had your dad, you had your mom, you had your issues, not because it was personal to you, but it's just what consciousness put into you. That was to be your life. And I'm a bit of a determinist that way. I'm a bit like, your life is kind of predetermined, your death is kind of predetermined, not hardcore, but there is a sense in me that, when I was a physician, I would see people that would, be healthy and run, and then they would drop dead at 48. And I would see people that would drink themselves in like puddles and smoke and live to like 89,
Mm.
so it's kind of like I have this sort of deterministic thing that I think much of our life is pre-programmed. And I think when we develop the awareness that we can see that these are patterns, there's a railroad that our life is going to go on. Now, you can branch out of that railroad, but if the railroad's in Great Britain, you're not going to get off Great Britain, but you can, go to places maybe in Great Britain that you'd like to go to, rather than places that you're not. I don't know if that's making sense, but I think there really is this sense of determinism in our lives. And I think we believe in this sense of free will, like we can do anything. And I don't know if that's actually true. I
Yeah.
think it's just creating this sense of awareness that you have a lot more of an overview of your life than what you believe that you do. And a lot of your thoughts aren't you. They're basically just a reactive part of you that formed usually because of trauma.
Yeah. I'm curious to learn if you felt like you weren't trusting yourself 10 plus years ago
Yeah.
because you were taught not to trust yourself, or if it was something else.
I think I just had so much pain, and I drove myself so hard, like becoming a physician and a stand-up comedian and to some extent a writer and that kind of thing. I think I forced myself into these things that became lucrative for me financially. Well, maybe not stand-up, but medicine certainly was. That wasn't really me.
Mm.
It was kind of like I was grasping at things, and I sublimated that energy. I took that negative energy and I created something with it. But in creating something, I was always kind of looking for external validation rather than giving the validation to myself. And I think it's a combination. I don't think there's these things I see on Instagram. It's like, if you give everything to yourself, you'll never lack for anything. I do think we need other people. Like we are wired to need other people. The idea of giving it to yourself is so important, but you have to have a model of that too. And this comes back to childhood. If you had a parent that really showed you that you were loved for who you were, then you have that internal sense that that's the case. If you don't have that, and I don't think most of us do have that, I think we continually search for it outside in money and business and in, external validations of success. And then when we get those successes, we're still not happy because it's like, that wasn't the ultimate reason. We tell ourselves that we get up to the top of Mount Everest, that at the top, we're going to feel amazing, which you do for about 2 days. But then after that, you're back. It's the old, no matter where you go, there you are. Like the old Wayne Dyer thing. It's like, if you need it from the outside, let me get this. If you want it from the outside, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you need it from the outside, there is something wrong with that.
That makes a lot of sense, and I could definitely resonate with that because I've sought it on the outside for many, many years of my life.
Me too.
So, yeah, I think it's a part of it to an extent. It goes back to like what you were saying, how you wouldn't change it. I mean, I very much so believe in divine plans and timing and all of that stuff as well. And it's like, hey, this was my life for a reason. You gotta run with it. You gotta run with it. So. I'm going to ask you 2 more questions. I'm going to try and squeeze these out of you here. This question was asked to me by Dr. Michael Gervais, and I said I'm going to ask it to every other guest that ever comes on this show. The question is, how would my life be different if I knew what you know?
I think you would have a lot more awareness of what's hidden from you, specifically emotionally. Going into your body, feeling safe, even though your body is alarmed, teaching yourself that, there are negative things that happen to us. And if you ground yourself first, specifically in your body, things can't hurt you. They can challenge you for sure. But the hurt comes from what you do to yourself. It's like the old saying with the Buddha, right? It's like, pain in this life is unavoidable, but suffering is optional. So we're all going to experience pain, divorce, death of our parent, or death of our dog, whatever. But it's what we do to ourselves after that pain, that what Buddha calls the second arrow. That's optional.
Yeah.
And it's just like, I help people see that a lot of their suffering is optional.
I love that. For clarity, I probably should have asked this a little bit earlier, but when you say get into your body, are you talking about turning to your breath? Are you talking about movement? What is it exactly?
It's personal to everybody. Like sometimes when I'll say get into your body, some people will get a physical sensation. It's like, oh, I just feel this pressure in my chest or my throat or whatever. I'm just going to go there. Some people, it is this sense of like, I'll fill up my chest. I'll fill up my lungs. Some people, it's more muscular. I just feel like I'm in my shoulders. I remember when I wasn't working out for a long time, like over COVID, it just felt like my arms were just all over the place. And then I started working out again, and it felt like my muscles all sort of joined together as a big unit again. And it was a palpable sensation. So I think it's different for different people. But I think it's really important. And sometimes in somatic therapies, we sort of say, what's in your smell system right now? Like, what do you smell? Like, what do you see? There's that, the 5 things you can taste, 5 things you can, all this sort of stuff, which, helpful for some people. I don't use it very much, but it's really like, okay, what's in your visual system right now? What can you hear? What can you smell? What can you touch? What can you taste? Like, what brings you into your body, and how do you know you're in your body? And the paradox there is, you can only describe to someone how you feel in your body with words, and as soon as you bring something into words, it loses its meaning. So, and I kind of felt that on psychedelics too. Like, so much of what we explain to ourselves and others isn't really what we're actually feeling. It's our interpretation or our perception of what we're feeling, but it's not really what the ultimate source of that is. And so often those self-explanations come from our childhoods and come from habit and come from repetition, and they're not real. So if we can actually allow ourselves to go very, very deep into the sensation, like drill down. Is it superficial? Is it deep? Is it hot? Or is it cold? Really drill down as deep as you can into sensation. And the little mantra that I use is sensation without explanation. And I say that to myself every day. Sensation without explanation. Like when I'm going through a difficult time with something, it's like, stay in your body, stay with sensation. Notice the compulsion that your mind is going to want to grab and explain this and make you feel better and make you and reassure you. And it's like, that's not what you need. You need to feel it. You need to process it and allow it to be there. Because as soon as you go into your head, you've lost it.
That sounds like acceptance too.
Yeah, and not only acceptance too, Matt, it's actually embracing the pain. That's the thing. When you actually embrace the pain, you in the periaqueductal of your brainstem, you start creating. Sorry, I'm getting a call. You start creating your brain's natural morphine. When if you see somebody across the room and you want to go talk to them, you can go two ways. You can go, oh, they're too attractive for me. Like I'm never going to, you can go into victim mentality, do that. Your brain will start secreting norepinephrine and your body starts creating cortisol, which reaffirms to you, no, that person is out of reach. That's too scary. I'm not going to do it. Or you can start walking towards that person. Your periaqueductal gray will start creating your own brain's morphine to support you. You'll also secrete dopamine because you feel like you're on the right track, and that will support you. So whatever decision you make and whatever behavior you follow, your brain will support you. Your brain will support you in being a victim, and your brain will support you in actually going towards what you want.
I love that. One last question for you in the last few minutes here. Dr. Russ lives to whatever year he wants to live to. He does all he wants to do. He signs on with the book publisher, and it goes from 60,000 to 60 million copies sold. Like whatever it is you want to do is accomplished in this lifetime. But you can only be remembered for one piece of advice. Meaning, if I walk past your tombstone, that's the piece of advice that's etched into it. What advice is that?
Stay in your body, get out of your head.
Stay in your body and get out of your head. I love it.
Get out of your head.
I love it. I love it. Dr. Russ, this has been incredible. Expressing gratitude for this. I mean, I could talk to you the rest of the night, but seriously, thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thanks so much, Matt. I'm sure we'll do this again.
I love it. Dr. Russ, this was fantastic. Seriously, I mean that.